Every person who arrives here on a tourist visa and then claims asylum should also be taken off to Nauru. There's no suggestion that's going to happen.
So people arriving by plane aren't going to be taken too.
Why pick on people who, because of desperation, happen to arrive here by boat? I wouldn't have thought that the mode of transport should determine your future fate.
Well, I think it's foolish to throw around words like appeasement with all the historical resonances that carries when we are talking about a friendly nation, one of Australia's closest relationships, and as I was at pains to point out earlier, an emergent democracy whose emergence as a democracy, as a liberal democracy, Australia has every interest in encouraging and in which the Indonesian people are succeeding.
Erica Feller in Geneva, you're a senior UN official for the protection of refugees. How do you see this situation from where you sit?
Well, I don't want to comment particularly on the situation, but I can say that UNHCR is particularly unhappy about the response, and that is legislation which in effect shifts Australia's responsibilities or deflects them elsewhere, and certainly circumvents the operation of the 1951 Convention to which Australia is a party, circumvents its proper operation in Australia.
But can you understand the dilemma for a government that's keen to maintain good relations with a sensitive neighbour on the one hand and deal with arrivals on the other?
Well, we can certainly understand that dilemma. It's not a dilemma that Australia faces alone. But there are ways and ways of dealing with those dilemmas, and we have already said to the government that we'd be very happy to work with the government to find a way which addresses these sorts of concerns, but at the same time does it in a way which doesn't do damage to the international protection regime, which has been set up now since 1951 and is fundamental if refugee protection is going to be achieved.
Okay, now how does this proposal, this legislation, which hasn't been passed, by the way, but is before the Parliament now, how does that threaten those things you talk about? What is your main objection to the idea of people being processed offshore?
The legislation to be passed as we understand it, and I say as we understand it because we haven't actually seen the arrangement which Australia has with, I understand, Nauru, which would allow this legislation to be implemented on Nauru. But our understanding of it is that it will enable Australia to take even those people who arrive directly from their countries of origin by boat offshore to another country which is not a party to the 1951 Convention, to have their claims processed there without any guarantee that there's going to be solutions immediately available for them, where there are fewer guarantees than there would otherwise be available in Australia, such as access to the courts or access to proper legal assistance for the affected persons. And our concern is it will leave quite a number of people sitting in limbo, in detention-like situations, waiting for elusive solutions.
George Brandis, your response to that? What is going to happen to people if they don't have legal assistance and access to review tribunals and courts and so on?
What that contribution missed was that the assessment will be made in Nauru by Australian authorities according to the Australian law. The place of assessment will be offshore, but the principles to be applied and those applying the principles will be Australian. And the other point that, yes, I am. The other point that's been
Australian law, the Migration Act,
that's been missed in this debate is how extensive Australia, how generous Australia has been in welcoming humanitarian migrants and refugees. Last year, Australia accepted 13,500 humanitarian entrants, of whom about 5,500 were on refugee visas. The previous year, 10,500. Last year, we accepted more refugees into Australia than in any year since immediately after the Second World War, and that point is being lost in this debate.
Okay,
Are you saying the Migration Act will apply?
As I understand it, yes.
That means they'll have access to the Refugee Review Tribunal and the courts, but they'll have to do it remotely from Nauru. Are you serious?
That's my understanding of the legislation.
I think you're wrong.
The legislation doesn't say that.
Mary Crock, you're a lawyer. What does the legislation say?
Well, the legislation is very simple. It simply says that if you come by boat without authorisation, without a visa, you are unable to make an application in Australia. That's all the legislation says. So, to the best of my knowledge, if you're processed on Nauru, then the procedures that we had after the Tampa would apply, And on Nauru, people had no access to lawyers. They certainly had no access to independent review authorities.
The Australian authorities and the UNHCR are the authorities that process applicants on Nauru.
But they weren't applying Australian law.
They're not applying Australian law. You cannot say that they're being processed under the Migration Act.
But what they're applying is the Convention.
Well, that's different from Australian law.
They're applying the principles of the Convention, which is embodied in Australian law.
Erica, can I get a response from you to this and to the point that George Brandis made about Australia being generous in its acceptance of people seeking asylum and of genuine refugees?
Well, Australia's certainly been generous. Over many, many years, it has a big resettlement program, and it takes some 6,000 people that UNHCR refers to it every year out of a total of around about a 13,000 humanitarian intake. It is a generous country in terms of resettlement, but we're not talking about resettlement at this point. We're talking about people who are coming directly onshore, and one thing that UNHCR has always been very concerned about is having resettlement seen to somehow balance out responsibilities to direct arrivals. One is not the substitute for the other.
The last time we had asylum seekers on Nauru, their claims were assessed by both Australia and the UNHCR, as I understand it. If you're invited to process people on Nauru or anywhere else offshore under this new system, if this new system does in fact go ahead, will you help Australia out?
What we've said about the current proposal is that we would be, I have to say, pretty reluctant about assuming any processing responsibilities. We don't normally do that for states like Australia with a very highly sophisticated and developed national asylum system. It's the sort of thing we do in countries where there is no asylum system, there's no domestic law and no traditions, and Australia is certainly not one of those.
Well, that's true, but if Australian authorities process asylum seekers on Nauru by applying, in accordance with Australian legal principles, the Refugee Convention, then you wouldn't complain about that, would you?
Well, if the processing is done with full due process respected, and if there's full access to what is automatically available to persons who arrive by plane or any other means on shore, then it would be a much better situation. What it wouldn't resolve, however, would be some of the other factors of this proposal. And again, as I said, I'm speaking a little bit in the abstract because we don't know exactly how it might work out. But if it leaves people in detention-like situations without any access to solutions for a longish period of time, and let's be honest, that's what happened in relation to the last caseload of people who went to Nauru, then our concern would be also about the conditions, not only the process, but the conditions it puts people in and the prospects it leaves them with.
Alexander Casella, you're in Geneva as well, and you were a senior official with the UNHCR, and you're now a migration consultant. What's your response to what you've heard so far? How do you view this situation in Australia at the moment?
Well, I think it's extremely important to stick with the bottom line. And what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that no refugee should be sent back to a country where he's persecuted. That's the basis. The second bottom line is that every credible asylum seeker, and I insist very much on the word credible, and most of the people who come by boat are actually not credible, because not only are they very wealthy people, but more importantly, they transited through countries where they could have asked for asylum and did not. Most credible asylum seekers should be given a hearing. And last but not least, you must preserve the integrity of the Australian asylum migration system. Now, where you process them, inshore or offshore, is completely irrelevant to the issue as long as a refugee is protected.
Erica, I know you have to go in a minute. A quick response from you to that?
With all respect to Sasha, it does make a difference where a case is processed. If where a case is processed leaves people, as I said, sitting in limbo without due process protections, without access to solutions, in detention for long periods of time. It is not correct to say, I think, that the large majority of people who come by boat, just by virtue of the fact that they come by boat, are improper asylum seekers or not genuine asylum seekers. If you look at the statistics of those whose cases were determined on Nauru before, you find a very large percentage of them were determined to have good cases and in fact were resettled, including, albeit in small numbers, back to Australia. So there is no correlation between the method of arrival and the validity of the claim. This new legislation, depending on how it is implemented, has the possibility of actually running against that Article 31 of the Convention, which says that there should be no penalisation for illegal entry.
Okay, I'd like to get a response from you, Alexander Casella.
Well, I've always disagreed with Erica while I was at UNHCR. Also, we worked for the same organization. And obviously, we represent two very distinct points of view. In the real world, there is a difference between somebody who pays $10,000 to be transported by ship and somebody who pays $500 to buy a cheap ticket. You're not dealing with the same social group.
George?
Well, the correction I'd like to make to the lady from the UNHCR is to emphasise the point that there must be no discrimination as to the mode of arrival so long as the asylum seeker presents themselves to have their case assessed, the genuineness of their claim to be a refugee assessed. The experience in Australia in relation to unauthorised boat arrivals, not merely the West Papuan case, but cases of people smugglers from Indonesia, was that was not happening.
Erica, I do know you have to go. I'll just get a quick response from you before you leave. And in advance, thank you very much for joining us tonight. But would you like to just respond to that?
Well, I can't talk about the broad experience in Australia, but it's my understanding that when people arrive and they put their foot on shore and they are asylum seekers, they then seek to have their claim determined. I don't say that everybody who comes by boat is a refugee. I say probably the small percentage of them are. But it's fundamentally important to find that small percentage and to identify who they are and what their needs are and have their needs met. And our concern, leaving aside all the legal issues and whatever, our concern is that Australia does not set a bad precedent in a region where things are evolving fast and where precedents are few and far between and need to be there to be emulated.
Aladdin, you want to...
Okay, we are the suffering ones. It's not Australia, not America, not the UNHCR. We are the one who missing a real mechanism in the world to avoid us risking our life in the ocean, in this jungle, and come and climb and sit in the TV and listen to all this just to have a chance in life.
Now, you spent 18 months in...
I spent 15 years, man.
In detention on Manus Island, though, didn't you?
Yeah, in Manus Island.
And you're here on a temporary protection visa, is
That's
that right?
right.
And what was it like for you on Manus Island?
What's it like for me? Do you have time to explain that?
Well, try and give us a short answer if you can.
Yes, it's bad. It's bad. It's not nice.
Why was it bad?
It's jail.
It's jail.
It's the stuff there was putting to do their best to make you change your mind about seeking asylum in Australia.
Julian Burnside, if this new law is passed, boat arrivals will be processed offshore. You have